All right. So as I have mentioned, my name is Jackie Eaton, and I am the Community Action Program for Children Training and Education Coordinator. And I work out of the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute, which is located in Saskatoon. We are a nonprofit organization that is located in Saskatoon, but we are provincial in scope. And so to begin this presentation, I would just like to extend my sincere appreciation for having the opportunity to be on Treaty 6 land and the homeland of the Métis. And this presentation is being shown from that treaty land and homeland. If you feel comfortable, please feel free to enter in the chat what treaty land you are participating from. Because we are a provincial organization, I just want to acknowledge that Saskatchewan Prevention Institute, Saskatchewan is located on treaty lands 2, 4, 5, 8, and 10, in addition to 6 and homeland of the Métis. The Saskatchewan Prevention Institute has been around for over 40 years, and truly, I believe, is one of a kind in Canada. We work to reduce the occurrence of disabling conditions in children, and we do that through primary prevention methods. We raise awareness through training and information and resources. And we truly believe at the Institute that every child, regardless of ability, deserves the right to the best physical, social, and emotional health possible. And so it is my true pleasure to have Maria Sunias Ali share with us today. Maria used to work at the Prevention Institute, and so we have had some time over the last few years to get to know each other on many different areas, but she now is working at the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission and was so generous with her time to be able to come and talk with us about children's rights, because we, at least at the Institute, really see that children's rights are vital to the work that we are doing. And I'm sure for many of you that are working with families, you see the importance of that as well. So I am going to read Maria's bio, and then I will be passing it on to her. So born and raised in Saskatoon, Maria grew up on the west side, where she attended her initial years of education with a year of high school spent in Australia. Maria has a degree in international studies from the University of Saskatchewan and her Master's of Arts degree in international law and human rights from the University for Peace in Costa Rica. Her work with the Wanuskewin Heritage Park and Aboriginal Friendship Centers of Saskatchewan brought her closer to her identity, culture, and family. Her work with the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute focused on youth health promotion and rights. Currently, Maria is working for the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission. She has served for several years on the City of Saskatoon's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, as well as serving multiple terms on the Saskatchewan Intercultural Association Board of Directors. Maria is the mother of Reina and Shahan. So Maria, I will pass it on to you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for joining today and taking part in this webinar. I hope that I'm able to share some information with you that is relevant to your life, to your work, that gets you thinking a little bit more about child rights in a tangible way, if possible, in how you can contribute to benefiting the children around you in their rights and quality of life. And with that, I think that I will get started. So I'm just going to share my screen. And I will stop for questions periodically. I have a couple different topics, and after each one, I'll stop for a couple seconds, a couple minutes of questions, if that's all right. So can everybody hear that? See that? I have been off on maternity leave for the past 15 months. So my Zoom expertise leaves much to be desired. Let's just leave it that way. I'm very out of practice. Okay, perfect. All right, so the title of my presentation today is Children's Rights in 2021, Progress, Setbacks, and Ongoing Issues. And as Jackie already acknowledged, I'm presenting from Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. So what exactly are human rights? I'll start with that. I think many people know in a general sense what human rights are, but more specifically, human rights are rights that we have simply because we exist as human beings. They're not granted by any state. And these are universal rights that are inherent to all of us, regardless of nationality, sex, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. They range from the most fundamental, the right to life, to things that make life worth living, such as the right to food, education, work, health, liberty. So more specifically, and the reason why we are here today, what are children's rights? So this is an excerpt from the preamble on the Convention of the Rights of the Child. It's quite lengthy. I had a hard time narrowing it down, but I am going to read through this with you just as I feel it sums it up as best as any definition possibly could, specifically what the rights are of a child versus that of human rights alone. So recalling that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the United Nations has proclaimed that childhood is entitled to special care and assistance, convinced that the family as a fundamental group of society and the natural environment for the growth and well-being of all of its members, and particularly children, should be afforded the necessary protection and assistance so that it can fully assume its responsibilities within the community, recognizing that the child, for the full and harmonious development of his or her personality, should grow up in a family environment in an atmosphere of happiness, love, and understanding. And as what you will note throughout the presentation, family comes up time and time and time again. Considering that the child should be fully prepared to live an individual life in society, and in particular in the spirit of peace, dignity, tolerance, freedom, equality, and solidarity, bearing in mind that the need to extend particular care to the child exists, and bearing in mind that, as indicated in the Declaration of the Rights of the child by reason of his physical and mental immaturity needs special safeguards and care. Recognizing that in all countries in the world, there are children living in exceptionally difficult conditions, and that such children need special consideration. Taking into account of the importance of the traditions and cultural values of each child, of each people, for the protection and harmonious development of the child, and recognizing the importance of international cooperation for improving the living conditions of children in every country, in particular in developing countries. So when were human rights and child rights laws and conventions created? So internationally, some of the most well-known are the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the United Nations on December 10th, 1948. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, just a little note, something interesting about it, reset a world record as of 2016 for being the most translated document in the world with over 500 translations. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, I will refer to as the CRC throughout the presentation, is also a human rights and child's rights document, and it came into force in September 2nd, 1990. So nationally, some of the human rights and child rights conventions, acts, bills, etc., that have been created are the Canadian Bill of Rights, which was created in 1960, and it is the first federal human rights law in Canada. The Canadian Human Rights Act, which was passed in 1977, is an act that extends the reach of the Canadian laws that focus on discrimination and legal resolution. With that came the creation of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. And this act applies to the Government of Canada, First Nations governments, and federally regulated private businesses, including banking, airlines, telecommunications, and broadcasting, as well as interprovincial transportation sectors. So this was something that is relevant in my work at the Human Rights Commission. Sometimes people will apply and have various concerns or complaints that they want to make. And while they say, oh, well, I work in the province, this is a Saskatchewan issue, depending on who they work for, what the grievance might be, we actually have to refer them to the Canadian Human Rights Commission because it falls under more federal jurisdiction. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was passed in 1982, and that charter covers basic rights and freedoms seen to be key in fair and democratic societies, such as your fundamental freedoms, democratic rights, mobility rights, legal rights, equality rights, official language rights, and minority language rights. Specific to children's rights in Canada, we have signed and ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child and 2 of the optional protocols as of December 12, 1991. The optional protocols that Canada is a signatory to are the rights of the child in the involvement of children in armed conflict, and the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. So this section outlines provincially some of the options that we have related to human and child rights. So we have the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code, which was revised in 2018, and the Human Rights Code regulations are kind of a sister document to that. They outline some of the more procedural details as related to the code. The Human Rights Commission, Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission, works specifically with those documents. Some more documents that we have are Touchstones of Hope, which was created in collaboration in 2005 with Indigenous communities, government officials, experts in the area of child welfare, and coming up with a document that guides the care of Indigenous children within the child welfare system. The Saskatchewan Children and Youth First principles were adopted by the provincial government by the recommendation of the Saskatchewan Child and Youth Advocate in February 2009. And those 2 documents are documents that the Saskatchewan Child and Youth Advocate work with directly when working in their area of care, investigation, child welfare, and so forth. So some local resources and human rights relevant organizations. Some of these, perhaps all of them, if you are from Saskatchewan, are not new to you. They're not maybe all your most obvious example of human rights organizations, but they do touch on child rights very specifically and work with the goal of fulfilling those rights for children. So the most obvious example, I guess, would be the Saskatchewan Advocate for Children and Youth, as well as the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission. Other examples would be Telemiracle, working to provide equal care, equal access to healthcare and services for all children throughout our province. The Kinsman Children's Center and Alvin Buckwell Child Development Program, very kind of similar vein in its equality towards children and their physical, mental, emotional needs, and supporting families in that way. EGAD supports youth in a very meaningful way as related to safety, health, community support, and so forth. And also in a way that if they are not experts in that area, they assist the youth in finding the help that they need. Camp Easter Seal is another one that I thought was worth mentioning. The right to play and the right to recreational activities is a right for children. And they do what they do very well. They support kids with disabilities to be able to fulfill those rights and take part in things that them and their families may otherwise not have had access to. Sanctum 1.5 is something that will come up throughout this presentation as well. And I listed them because I believe, as listed in the definition of child rights, that the goal is to maintain the family unit for the best interests of the child specifically, but assisting the parent in that care as well. So that's something that I think is really wonderful that has come about in the last few years for Saskatoon specifically. So one of the topics that I'm going to briefly touch on related to child rights in general. We can't really ignore what has been happening in the world for almost the last 2 years, I'm sorry to say, but COVID-19 and how it has affected the rights of children. So COVID-19 has disproportionately affected children in poorer countries, those living in poverty, and groups that already experienced marginalization prior to the pandemic. Some of those groups would be refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers. That is something that I will get into more depth about later, but a group that was already seen to be at great risk and in many ways neglected to see their rights fulfilled, even more so related to the pandemic, ethnic and religious minorities, and children with disabilities and or health concerns. On that point, we think about, when I'm speaking here, I started out referring to poorer countries. We all know very well how it has affected children in our own lives, in our own families day to day. I have 2 small children. One is too young to know that there's been any effect, and one I know has had her struggles with it throughout the last 18 months. So, and children with disabilities or health concerns in specific, recent rearranging of healthcare staff has seen, unfortunately, a lot of care that would have gone to kids that need various procedures, surgeries, therapies going without right now. So in that way, it's affected us very directly at this immediate moment, even within one of the most highly developed and wealthiest countries in the world. So the right to education has been impacted. The right to educational and technological resources has affected 1.5 billion children in 188 countries worldwide. That is another thing that even in Saskatchewan, we know has been an issue, especially towards the beginning of the pandemic when school went online. Not everybody has access to a tablet or a laptop or a smartphone that would allow for the quality needed for children to attend online classes. And that is a barrier. That is a serious barrier that affects the rights of children. The right to information and justice has been restricted and in many cases neglected by states during the periods of lockdown. When people think, I think in a general sense, perhaps, of rights of children, you don't always think of their rights to information and knowledge. Even the internet is a right, and children have those same rights as adults do. Physical and mental health have been impacted due to social distancing and isolation requirements. It is very difficult, as I'm sure many of you know, or you have seen, or you have experienced when talking to friends or family that have children. It's tough for them to be away from their friends, away from their usual activities, as was the case previously in many places throughout our country. Keeping in mind that in Saskatchewan, in many cases, we are very lucky to have a smaller population and a lot of space. And other parts of the world, I'm thinking of mega cities, perhaps, it doesn't even have to be a mega city, but for example, Hong Kong or Karachi, you have families that live in apartments that when they leave their apartment, there aren't green spaces readily available for children to go to expend that energy, to get fresh air. And the lockdowns that took place in those places really strained family units in many cases for people. Financial hardships have had a direct effect on access to food and medical services. So while this directly does affect children, it also affects family units as a whole. The United Nations policy brief, The Impact of COVID-19 on Children, has stated that 368.5 million children in 143 countries worldwide have relied on school meals for their daily nutrition. So when schools shut down, what do these children eat? What kind of stress does this put on the family unit to provide this food? Is there any alternative? So that's a very real concern that many people live with daily. The pandemic has caused greater risk of physical, mental, emotional, and sexual abuse to children, with less exposure to schools, recreational, and social interactions outside of the home. I'm thinking of, if a child was dealing with abuse at home, attending school can provide a safe space for them to seek assistance. Or if they don't seek the assistance, it's the opportunity for other adults to perhaps notice that something is not quite right. And so when everything shut down, who sees the children and who did the children see, I guess, to seek safety if needed? There are increased risks of exposure to online threats and inappropriate content, more screen time for leisure as well as educational purposes has just, equated to higher risks of exposure to those things. And unfortunately, in many cases, girls face a particular increased risk of trafficking, forced labor, and forced marriage as a result of financial hardships that have come as a result of the pandemic, the lockdowns, the loss of jobs, tourism, whatever that might be that has impacted people internationally. Are there any questions before I continue on to the next topic? Okay. So the next area that I want to touch on are Indigenous children in Canada's child welfare system. I want to begin by saying that this is for anybody that is joining me that works within the child welfare system. This is not to be negative only. There is obviously a need, and it is a child's right to be protected from harm. But there are some things that have been pointed out time and time again that are questionable, that are concerning, specifically related to the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the welfare system. So as of currently, there's no centralized method for tracking the number of children in care or the form of care in which they are in, whether that be in out-of-home care, whether that be within familial care, or whether that be directly with their family unit in care, or a standard reporting methods, as this falls into regional and provincial jurisdiction. So as of June 2020, 86% of children in care in Saskatchewan were Indigenous, and that was about 3,412 children. First Nations children aged 0 to 15 years in Canada were 3.6 times as likely to be the subject of child maltreatment investigations compared to non-Indigenous children in 2019. Something that was, I believe, widely practiced across Canada at one point in time is not widely practiced now. I think it's only maybe largely in the Maritimes, I believe, that they still practice birth alerts. But this was called for concern by many communities. It has disproportionately affected Indigenous and racialized mothers in particular. And for those that are not familiar, child welfare birth alerts are when child welfare services notify a hospital that they believe an expectant mother is high risk and that a newborn baby may need protection. It can lead the baby to being seized without the mother's consent, and sometimes quite quickly after birth. So as recently as February 2021, Saskatchewan ended the use of birth alerts due to mounting pressure from Indigenous communities and human rights groups. On a positive note, I would like to say that Sanctum 1.5 has been seen to be a positive alternative, in a sense, to replace that practice. They have had an overwhelming response to people wanting to seek care there with their newborn child, but they have a wait list. So the need is great for such services within Saskatchewan. This is just an example of the disparities between rates of child welfare service depositions for First Nations and non-Indigenous children. So this is an example taken from studies done in 2019. And you can see that Indigenous children were more likely to, for example, be placed in out-of-home care through going through the system than non-Indigenous children. There's just continuing disparities throughout the process that are seen along racial lines. So recent mainstream notoriety of residential schools. I say recent mainstream notoriety because within the Indigenous community, the information that has become more widely publicized, more widely known, has been known for decades and decades and decades. And being a child of a residential school survivor, I took the liberty of putting in brackets genocidal institutions. That's my personal belief. I don't feel school is a fitting term for what the intention of those schools were. So recent mainstream notoriety of residential schools and the 60s scoop has highlighted the repercussions of the sustained long-term removal of Indigenous children from their families, language, culture, and traditional teachings. The touchstones of hope, which I mentioned earlier that the Child Advocate's Office work closely with, as well as the child welfare system itself, are an effort to create change related to the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care, but more time and effort are required to see long-term change. A positive development that occurred not too long ago, earlier this year, Cowessess First Nation became the first First Nation in Canada to reclaim full decision-making power over children and youth as related to their own welfare system. On that note, Indigenous Services Canada have received 38 requests for similar jurisdiction, representing 100 Indigenous communities and groups, and Cowessess is the first to have their process completed. So the goal is, in this context, for Indigenous communities to take over those systems themselves, meaning that the struggle that I know is that I have heard is real within the child welfare system is to find language, culture, familial placement for Indigenous children. There are more Indigenous children in care than there are Indigenous people able to provide care within the foster system for the children. So this is seen as a possible turn to that, a possible alternative that will provide those options, which in turn are the children's rights to them. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has listed several changes to the child welfare system that they would like to have seen. One being reducing the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care. Another being publishing data related to the number of children in care, why they are in care, and the costs associated with such services and processes. They would also like to see a full implementation of Jordan's principle. And for those of you that are not familiar, Jordan's principle is a child-first principle aimed at ensuring First Nations children can access public services that are ordinarily available to other Canadian children without experiencing any service denials, delays, or disruptions related to First Nation status. Jordan was a young boy that I believe lived for 5 years entirely in a hospital, and that was due to disagreements in who would pay for his care. It was never settled, and sadly he passed away. And this is a principle that has come out of that to ensure that children get the care that they need, regardless of their status, regardless of whether it's a First Nations child or not, to fully live their life as much as possible with their family while maintaining the healthcare services that they need. Another recommendation is that legislation allows Indigenous communities to be in charge of their own child welfare services. So on the last slide, as I mentioned, Cowessist has become the first, but many other communities are also applying to take over that system for themselves, and need to develop culturally appropriate parenting programs, which is also very important, very vital to seeing a positive change for everybody, I think, within the system and in fulfilling child's rights to the fullest. So how does this system affect Indigenous children's rights? So all children, all actions regarding children shall be done with best interests of the child as a priority, and that applies to all children. No arbitrary interference of privacy, family, home, or correspondence is considered to be acceptable. That's a violation of a child's right. That being said, it is the state's duty to intervene if the child is seen to be a victim of abuse or neglect, or other inherent rights such as education, safety, are not being met. Children cannot be subject to discrimination based on inherent traits or association. And I think that there are a lot of feelings that that is not being followed through either, given the high number overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the system compared to the small percentage of our society as a whole that they actually represent. So maintenance of family connections is a right of any child and can prove difficult to maintain within the current welfare system for a number of reasons, and not without trying. As I mentioned, I know that there is a goal to always put Indigenous children with other Indigenous families, or to maintain language or community or culture, and that's not always possible. There are not always enough people able to care for those children as there are the number of children in care. A great efforts should be made to maintain continuity in a child's upbringing as related to language, culture, and religion. And while the removal of children in some cases is in the best interest of the child, a switch in focus to supporting parents and families is required. So, for example, a switch from birth alerts to Sanctum 1.5. I realize that in my presentation today, me saying that may come across as simplifying the issue. I realize that it's very complicated, but I think that's a truly positive example for so many people in the switch to putting children's rights and family connections first. Are there any questions on that topic? No? Okay. So my next topic is unaccompanied minors and the United States border crisis. So this picture, I chose some of these photos I apologize, they're not easy to watch. I find this in particular to be a very difficult subject to talk about because of the general lack of concern seemingly for thousands and thousands of children. But this is a photo that I'm sure many of you will have seen demonstrating where children are housed when they are being detained by the US government if they were to come across the southern border from Mexico, Central America, South America. This is the living conditions that they are put in while they are detained. So the United States is a signatory to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but they have not ratified this convention. Therefore, they are not legally bound by the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In March 2021, 2,800 children were awaiting placement in shelters where, for example, there were only an estimated 500 beds available for them. Al Jazeera News reported that an estimated 21,000 children, ranging from babies to teens, are being detained in 200 facilities in the United States. It is hard to find a lot of very detailed information on this topic. There has managed to be a skirting of the rules, if you will, with a lot of these facilities compared to regular law in the United States. They seem somehow managed to exist outside the law. And a lot of these rules, they don't apply to themselves. They do apply to them, but they don't apply to themselves. So a lot of this reporting and stuff has been done very secretly. People are worried about pushback as well. The border and migrants, asylum seekers is, I'm sure as many Canadians well know, a deeply, deeply divided and hot topic within the United States. These facilities are run by contracted companies. Some have pending lawsuits related to their lack of care for children, and others have no experience related to sheltering large numbers of children. So they are just contracted out. If they have the facility, okay, that's great. You can keep the children there. Questions have been raised as to the screening process for employees, whether or not it is appropriate for everybody to be working with children, whether it's safe, do they have a criminal history? A lot of those questions have come up. As well as, mentioning that they don't have adequate facilities to provide basic needs. 500 beds and tinfoil blankets are not meeting a child's rights. So in these facilities, children are not guaranteed access to educational services, legal counsel, or recreational opportunities. Zero tolerance policies have meant that those trying to illegally enter the United States were criminally prosecuted and families were separated. More than 4,300 children were removed from their families and recategorized as unaccompanied minors, even though they were not when they entered the United States, between the years of June 2017 and June 2018. That in its own, that zero tolerance policy goes against many, many basic rights of the child. Arbitrary removal from family is harmful. 30 days is seen to be the limit for detaining children by the Department of Health and Human Services in the United States. However, prior to 2021, children had been spending an average of 4 months within their system. So if you can imagine 4 months living in that picture that I showed you first, that's your life day in, day out. The Trump administration had made attempts to detain families indefinitely in crowded detention centers. This attempt, thank goodness, was blocked by federal judges in 2019. So while children are afforded some different and sometimes more lenient ways to claim asylum, they're often not given any legal assistance through the process or supported in any way, shape, or form through the process. It is not uncommon to see a small child alone sitting in front of a judge. And sometimes, in many cases, these children and the judge may not even speak the same language. Poor tracking of children has resulted, poor tracking of children within this detention system for migrant and asylum seeking children has resulted in them being lost within the system and unable to be found by parents or lawyers. There are numerous stories of parents being separated from their children and not being able to find where their child was taken to. They can be taken to many different states. They may have been deported. The parent may have been deported. And a lot of these people find it very hard to find their way back within such a system. There are instances of parents trying to find their children and finding them and being told that you have to pay for them to be flown back to you. If you are a refugee from El Salvador, for example, where will you find $1,500, $2,000 to pay for your child to be brought back to you? There are humanitarian organizations that exist that enforce laws. It is actually the US and their obligation to send the children back, especially unaccompanied minors, to the parents. But as I said earlier, they try to skirt around these laws as much as possible. And if you are in such a stressful position, maybe you do not speak the language well, in English in this case, it can be really hard to find the relevant organizations that will help you out to reunite you with your child. In most cases, the majority of these children, I believe it was around 66%, are relatively quickly just deported. Those children are not always deported back to countries where they know that their parents are or that their family is. That puts these young kids at great risk of gang initiation, gang violence, homelessness, trafficking, a variety of things that no child should be seemingly consciously subjected to. So in these centers, reports of physical, sexual abuse, and a lack of adequate supervision, poor sanitation, poor hygiene practices, COVID-19 and lice infestations, as well as poor quality nutrition, one example given was uncooked meat, have been reported from children and staff at these centers. So how does the system affect the rights of unaccompanied minors? I think after reading that, whether or not you had any more than a basic knowledge of human and child's rights, I think it's pretty clear that something is very wrong with such a system. All actions, just like with any other child, regarding children should be done with their best interests as a priority. And clearly that is not taking place within this system. Arbitrary interference of privacy, family, home, or correspondence is a right, and children cannot be subject to discrimination based on inherent traits or associations. In this case, being an unaccompanied minor, an asylum seeker, a refugee, a child from Central or South America, all of those traits. Maintenance of family connections is a right of any child and has been repeatedly violated within this context. I have included, I didn't want to get too legal within some of my presentation, but I have included a few articles here just because they very specifically talk about these circumstances. So Article 3.3 in the Convention on the Rights of the Child states that state parties should ensure that the institutions, services, and facilities responsible for the care or protection of children shall conform with the standards established by competent authorities, particularly in the areas of safety, health, in the number and suitability of staff, as well as competent supervision. All reports coming out of most of these institutions, shelters, seemingly say otherwise. Article 9.1 of the CRC, state parties shall ensure that a child shall not be separated from his or her parents against their will, except when competent authorities subject to judicial review determine in accordance with applicable law and procedures that separation is necessary or in the best interest of the child. As I spoke about on the last page, some of these children are separated and unable to be found by their families. Some of these children are deported while still not knowing where their families are. And to this day, I don't have an actual fact, a statistic for you, but I believe that the majority of children of the 4,300 that I listed earlier, the majority have still not been reunited with their families. They have been lost in the system. Parents have been deported. Family separation has seemingly become an insurmountable obstacle for these families at this point in time. If the state separates families, it is the state's responsibility to provide clear and essential information about the family member, either the child or parent. So anybody in care has the right to ask and to be told where their family member is, the condition of their health, their whereabouts, be able to talk to them in most instances. And the only exception is that if this information puts the child in danger. Article 22 of the CRC mentions that to protect and assist such a child and to trace the parents or other members of the family of any refugee child, or in order to obtain information necessary for reunification with his or her family in cases where no parents or other family members can be found, the child shall be accorded the same protection as any other child permanently or temporarily deprived of his or her family environment for any reason as set forth in the present convention. So to clarify, that states that, for example, the removal of children, if it is deemed to be necessary, there are children that do cross and are unfortunately brought over with traffickers, brought over with people that are deemed to be unsafe or not family members of this child. If the child needs to be removed, they fall under the same laws as, for example, any child in the child welfare system within the United States. So, you know, the child deserves education and care and safety and and on and on and on, clean clothes, nutritious foods, those things. So there should be no differentiation between a child that is an asylum seeker, a migrant, a refugee, and a child that is in the child welfare system, and that handling within the same country. Children have a right to play and to recreational activities. This is not a right that is acknowledged with this practice. Children have a right to education. Children have a right to protection from any form of abuse. And Article 37 of the CRC, points A to D, outline that loss of liberty should be the last resort and children should suffer no cruel or degrading treatment. Legal processes should be as quick as possible with the goal of reunification with family unless that is not the best interest of the child. The child is required to be supported to the best standards of the state throughout. And it kind of goes together with Article 22 in saying that, you know, the best standards that the state offers apply to any child that is in the state's care. under any circumstance. And it is the child's right to have an interpreter if necessary. It may seem obvious, but we have to remember that in this situation, the majority of these children will not be able to speak English well enough, if they do, to convey their needs, to understand the processes that they are going through, to understand why they are being removed from their families or why they are being held in these facilities, even to ask for help or even to claim asylum. And interpreters are not always made readily available. So in summary, while I hope that this hasn't been too much of a downer on your Tuesday afternoon, I hope that it's been real. It's been educational in learning the realities of some of these situations. It's not all negative, but when it comes to children and human rights, there are a lot of, there's always room for improvement. So in summary, while local, national, and international laws exist to protect children, enforcement of these laws and general checks and balances remain deeply problematic. Systems and institutions exist worldwide that take advantage of the youngest and the most vulnerable among us without any accountability. Being active participants for change in our communities and workplace is the only way to create better accountability, better systems, processes, and outcomes for children around the world. And I just want to mention this last point, to remember that just because something has always been done in a certain manner does not mean that there isn't a better way to do it. Sometimes it has, something has been established and it's been done for a period of time, and that's just the way it's been done. But is it putting the rights of children first? Is it doing what is best for children first? And if not, then there has to be another way that it can be done. And even if it is, then maybe based on different circumstances, there's different ways that it's best for different children. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I just want to say thank you very much for coming to listen to my webinar today. And thank you to Jackie and Connie for asking me to participate. And are there any questions? Anybody?
So feel free to ask questions in the chat. Thank you, Maria. As always, amazing. You have so much knowledge and information, and your passion for children and the rights of children comes through in every word that you share. So I want to extend my sincere appreciation for you and for all that you are able to provide for us and for us people that are working with children, and of course for your own children. I feel they are truly blessed to have the mother that has the expertise in a broader context. So thank you so much for sharing all of that.
That's very sweet.
No. So thank you everybody who was able to join us this afternoon. I am just putting in the chat a couple of different things. First off, some of you would have received an email from me. We do have a World Cafe for National Child Day scheduled for November 2nd. I believe the times are 1 to 2:30. And that is really an opportunity for people to get together and just have conversations. And we really want this to be focused on children's rights, as well as to talk about the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And if you haven't been a part of a World Cafe, there's really, it's like a conversation. And we've been able to provide this platform. It's again virtual. You could definitely do this in person if we could. But in this case, we are just doing a virtual. I see Jacqueline has her hand up. Did you want to share a question?
Hi, Jacqueline Thompson from Regina Treaty 4. And thank you very much for the presentation. I'm an educator, and since we returned to classes this year, I've had a lot of students, not a lot, but I've had more than normal disclose. So where I find the most trouble, the most challenge in the systems is that I don't know where to go when the social worker says they have, they're overwhelmed, they can't get to everything right away, there's a whole process. And then you have the police who say you have to wait for the social worker. So, in the meantime, these children are going home. And I don't know where to put pressure. Like, I've been at the police headquarters sitting there. I've been waiting for return calls to my voicemails at the ministry. And it's just getting ridiculous. Like, and so you gave a list of agencies that also we could contact. But I don't, any direction in where to put pressure is appreciated. Thank you.
I mean, it sounds like, first of all, those children are very lucky to have you to go to. And I'm sorry that that's been your entry into this new school year is with that really difficult information. But what you have said is initially what I would have suggested. It's really unfortunate that you're kind of been put on hold with such urgent matters. My next suggestion would be to contact the Youth and Child Advocate. They are kind of the experts provincially in child rights. And I would say that they would be able to put some pressure on to different agencies as a sense of urgency that something needs to be done, because if there's concern that there is ongoing abuse or concerns for safety and rights are not being upheld, then those children shouldn't be left in that situation to be vulnerable. So I would suggest contacting the Youth and Child Advocate here in Saskatoon. They work provincially. They're the Saskatchewan Child Advocate, and they would have further resources for you, different avenues for you to explore. I would believe, as that's their area of expertise. I hope that's helpful.
Marcy,
yes, thank you. I got the information. Thanks.
Perfect. Yeah, and then Marcy, you had your hand up, but I noticed you also put in the chat. So you must be with the, yeah, there's your picture. So if you want to share a little bit more information, please do.
Sure. Thank you, Maria. That's exactly what I would have said. And, definitely suggest Jacqueline yourself or anyone else who is facing barriers getting children and youth the services they need, such as through the Ministry of Social Services, can definitely give us a call. Our advocates could then, you're looking for someone to put pressure on the system. And of course we can make some calls. We can't, skip queues because it's all important. Certainly the cases of each child are important, but certainly we can put some pressure on the ministry to get some extra resources in a certain area if there's that particular area experiencing a higher demand of calls than others, and can, do what we can there. So yeah, thank you, Maria. That's exactly what I would have said.
And then Julie, it looks like you have a question.
Hi, yes, thank you for this opportunity. One of the struggles that we have, and I'm working and living in Prince Albert, and I'm talking over the last 20 years that I've been in various roles throughout health and trying to advocate for children in our area, is when it becomes family issues or they're involved in legal proceedings, things like that. Social services having the same limitations that I'm guessing everybody does with shortages. I know we have a significant shortage of staffing here, significant shortage of even places to place children if they do need to be apprehended. So like it appears as though a lot of decisions are made not necessarily in the children's best interest, but based on resources. And so it continues. Contacting the children's advocate, although absolutely I value the resource, has not been able to effectively address things like when courts are making decisions as well. I do know of, and I'm just going to use this as one of the examples, where there are domestic violence courts in other cities. We do not have that, and yet our numbers of certain situations for kids are really high in our area. When I have attempted to go through, for instance, the Children's Advocate, we were informed that they have no legislation with justice, if you will. And certainly judges tend to be an entity upon themselves. So I'm finding it really difficult and challenging that children are continuing to be sexually abused and in these situations, and nobody's responding. And in fact, I've had a judge, even just recently, who has silenced anybody from reporting any further on this child because in whatever way, in his decision, he decided this is all make-believe, despite the counselors involved, or the psychiatrists involved, or the police that have been involved, or even social services. So struggling with that and wondering if you had any insights, information, because I'm finding it almost overwhelmingly discouraging to a point where I'm struggling to even stay engaged because I don't know where else to go.
I feel as though, and I touched on this briefly in my presentation, that sometimes all of these systems, the bureaucracy and the processes, and on and on and on, and people being burnt out by working in such tough environments, like hearing these things every day and working with children that are facing these horrible situations all the time. It's tough and it's frustrating. And at this point, I guess it's the same thing that I said to Jacqueline, is that you have to continue with the processes that we have to a certain extent. So if you feel like there's imminent danger, contacting the police, higher ups throughout your place of work, contacting the youth and child advocate. And it's not only the youth and child advocate that you can contact when it's related to children. It is definitely possible for you to call the Human Rights Commission and speak to someone there about your concerns. This is not always the run-of-the-mill topic that we get, but it's definitely something that someone can look into there for you as well, if you wanted to attempt to take matters further. So I'm sorry, I don't have any more detailed information for you in that respect. I'm really sorry to hear that those are the responses of people, in the system, that they're not believing children, when even if it wasn't true, it should still be handled with the utmost urgency and seriousness. And I think that that's something that should potentially be taken further in respect to, contacting police and the Human Rights Commission and the Child Advocate. I hope that's even the slightest bit helpful to you.
Marcy raised a really good question, and I think this is to you, Julie, but maybe someone has an answer. So would there be any possibility to appeal the decision of the court and have it looked at by another judge?
In the most recent situation, and I'm talking within this year, there is not, because the family has been warned by the judge that if they are to bring anything further legally, they're not even, that they are, and again, I don't even know if legally he can do this, but he has done it, and they are now afraid of being charged themselves, because that's in essence what they were told. So
I don't believe that is like I don't believe that that is allowed when it comes to a child welfare system and family trying to seek assistance.
no, I agree. And that's why I'm saying in our area, for sure, I can speak to, this is not an uncommon incident. And so when we're looking at needing change in the legal processing, even if the children's advocate doesn't have any ability to, you know, I guess, advocate with them or have any real influence in the legal processing of things, or particularly in judges, that it just seems like we're in a position.
I would contact the Human Rights Commission. I would, because that
That'd be good.
told me is very concerning.
Mhm.
And if there is, you know, a concern on the fulfillment and infringement of rights, regardless of who that might be, that is what the office is there for. And while it may not speed up your day-to-day right now, the possibility of that, you know, if it's seen to be a concern of merit and it being taken forward, could be beneficial in a longer term sense, rather than just one immediate case. So I would contact them, speak to them. And this is something that maybe I can get back to you about one-on-one later as well.
Sure.
If you're able to send me a direct message with an email address or something, and then I can send you an email about that one-on-one later.
Yeah, no, that would be great. I like the idea of the Human Rights Commission. We've gone through PLEA and other organizations, so thank you, and I look forward to further contact.
Right.
And Julie, I can also share your email with Maria. I do have that. And then I don't know if you'd seen the comment in the chat from Marcy, that also the Canadian Judicial Council, she had put some contact information in there as well. Although that just may be for QB, not the provincial court. So sorry, Marcy, I'm not sure if I understand that, but thank you for sharing, Julie. I really, truly feel this is a very disheartening situation, and I appreciate your willing to share and for everybody's input on this. So I'll share Julie's email with Maria. Is there any more, Julie, that you'd like to share at this point?
No, thank you. I think I've depressed enough people and taken up enough time.
No,
Thank you.
No.
Thank you for your question, Julie. It's really important, because if you're facing this, Jacqueline's facing this, this is, you're not alone in this. And as I said, just because there's certain ways of doing things doesn't mean it's always the best way. So having these conversations and pushing further through whatever systems you have available to you are important, and these children are lucky to have both of you. There's one more question.
There is, yeah. So from Brooklyn. So,
and how would someone advocate for school systems to have better access for mental health resources for students? Or how would someone advocate for teachers to have better knowledge on youth, children, and the signs of abuse or neglect before being allowed to work with such demographic of people? So I guess you could advocate with the school boards itself, and that there should be some level of rights-based knowledge teaching put into curriculum, as well as into training for teachers as well. As far as better knowledge on recognizing signs of abuse or neglect, that's something my mind kind of goes again towards social services, the child and youth advocate. They may be able to assist you with that as far as presentations or whatever that might be for your specific school. But on a larger scale, I think it would be something that you would have to petition school boards to try and have implemented some of that information, or see if it could be taught as a part of a class. As far as I'm concerned, any health class should have a discussion on rights, for example. In elementary school, you should know, what consent is. Consent is a part of learning about your rights, all of those details. So yeah, that's kind of what I have to say. Now, did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. I was kind of just like, well, like that did answer part of my question, but like personally, I think that some of our teachers like lack knowledge on how to recognize signs, especially like their students say like a student isn't coming to school or like they're not doing great in school, and you can see that in their marks. And instead of like saying like, hey, do you need help, they more assume that the child isn't like trying. So personally, I just think like teachers should have different education on how to actually work with their demographic of people, instead of just being like they go to school to teach the curriculum that they have. They should actually know how to work with their demographic of people.
I mean, that could be something too that maybe you have already, but brought up with administrators and stuff for your specific school. If you wanted to start on kind of like a micro level, that can be a discussion that you have, in saying that you feel that there are bigger reasons for kids not coming to school or for poor marks. Even such things as just general education on rights, education related to reconciliation in general. All of those things, I think, kind of help fuel understanding of people's lives, of our society, of what is to be valued and protected as far as children's rights and stuff. And I think that that's a very valid thing that would be worthwhile to bring up to your school administrators. And maybe there can be some professional development that comes from that.
Go ahead, Marcy, you have your hand up.
Hi, I just wanted to, Brooklyn, I don't know if this is helpful or not, but certainly our office over the last couple of years has been working on a sort of systemic research report on mental health and addiction services and access to those in Saskatchewan for children and youth. And so had gone across the province prior to COVID, talking to people about that issue specifically, and definitely knowledge of mental health and addiction issues of teachers and the ability to recognize those signs. Didn't go into so much about the abuse and neglect part, but I know you talked about access for mental health resources for students as well, and that those are concerns that are brought up by people all across the province, and certainly a theme that we were seeing in our research and something that will be addressed, I think, in our systemic report. I'm not quite sure to the extent at this point, but hopefully that gives some hope, and at least it's something that is being looked at.
Great, thank you very much. Does anyone else have any other questions? Well, again, I just really want to thank you all for taking the time to come this afternoon. I've put a link in. We really appreciate feedback from people attending any of our trainings or webinars. And so if you could share, just your experience through the SurveyMonkey, it's all anonymous, but particularly we'd really appreciate any input onto future types of webinars or trainings that you would be interested in, because that is also, we really take that input very seriously and try to address the needs of the community in the province for sure. Again, I really want to thank Maria for a great afternoon, and I appreciate everybody's input and questions and conversation. And again, I really appreciate all the work that you are all doing to make this world a better place for our children. And
Thank you.
I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. As I mentioned, this presentation has been recorded, so I will be sending out the recording to the participants who are registered, as well as it'll be put on our website for other people to learn more about as well. So if you have any questions, please let me know, or if you wish to get in touch with Maria, just send me an email and I can forward your name on to Maria as well. So have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.